Welcome, Supervisor Mitchell.
Jessica, thank you very much for that too long but generous introduction. And let me just say, I've lost both of my parents, and people who have had that experience probably know kind of what I mean, that there's times like this when you're being recognized for your work, where you wish your parents were there to share it with you. Well, I know my father is, because see, I was that kid that was forced to take piano lessons. And to hear those scales in the background of your house lets me know that my dad is here with me. So thank your little pianist for me, for giving me an instant flashback to those Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. My father said, "You will regret not taking this more seriously one day." And he's right, I did ultimately. But I think the moral of that story is we have to let people guide the parents to the instrument of their choice, not the other way around. But thank you. That let me know my dad's in the house. And I appreciate you for being an active constituent. So thank you so much. And hello, UCLA Bruins. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I bring my full Highlander self to this space. I want to thank Grace and all the work you're doing there at UCLA for the center. I want to thank you for really establishing a safe space in which to have these academic conversations and hosting salons like we're doing today, to really talk about these critical issues around the intersection of feminism and social justice and education. To make sure that we are in a position of power to instill our life experience and these schools of thought into our next generation leaders. And let me say, it gives me great pride. It's truly humbling to be able to join the ranks of some sisters I know who I really believe fundamentally are badass. People like Alicia Garza, Kathy Spiller, who I've known really my entire professional career, and Paula Madison. So thank you for considering my work and what I bring to the public policy arena along the ranks of those true superheroes. I was asked to touch on a few things today, and I look forward to the conversation that I'll be able to engage in with both Grace and Jessica. But, issue of who inspired me. And I think inspiration is such an important thing for all of us to have in our lives every day. I had the pleasure of attending my freshman year in the Assembly, a training institute at the University of Virginia for freshman lawmakers. We had a stack of books we had to read, and I always thank my speaker, John Perez, for sending me. Because I came away from that experience, shared with about 100 other freshman assembly members from across the country, really making a decision about what I wanted to accomplish, kind of outside of the policymaking arena. And it really was to inspire. Sometimes it feels a little heady to say, I want to be an inspiration. But I walked away from that experience really understanding the role I could play in making policy making and the budget process understandable and tangible and relevant in the lives of people I was attempting to impact. And I knew by being an inspiration to inspire others to do this work was probably the best way I could accomplish really systemic change on behalf of every California resident at that time, and certainly now everyone who calls LA County home. And so when I think about the women who inspire me, the list is never finite. You see Rosa Parks here graces my dining room wall. When I think about courage and fearlessness and vision, when I think about women I've had the pleasure of meeting, women like Shirley Chisholm, who told the world she was unbought and unbossed and had the vision to run for president in 1972. When I think about my sister, Dolores Huerta, and her continuous fight on behalf of workers, there is not a righteous fight out there today that you don't see Sister Dolores at the front of the line, continuing to lead, continuing to inspire, and continue to give us vision. And then I have to say, I'm so inspired by young women I meet and have the opportunity to interact with and just even witness from afar today. The fact that the 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter have been, nominated for a Pulitzer. Stacey Abrams, her vision, not just when she maybe appeared on the national platform for some, but I first knew of her and met her back when she was a fellow state legislator in the Georgia House, and her vision around a multicultural organizing effort that led us to the place where she could run for governor, that led us to a place where she could build a nonprofit organization that really is the definition of intersectionality in terms of the areas they focus on, that could lead ultimately to a fight for voter protection and could allow Georgia to deliver 2 Democratic US senators. Those women inspire me each and every day. Grace talked about a group of women that we attempted to help access vaccines and immunizations. And when I think about the monolingual Spanish-speaking women that I met when I was CEO of Crystal Stairs, who wanted nothing more but a better opportunity for their children. When I think about the formerly incarcerated women who upon their release are re-entering society, attempting to reconnect with their own children and family members, to be a primary parent again, and all those challenges and obstacles. When I think about the little girls I met about 2 weeks ago at the Long Beach Convention Center, unaccompanied minors, some as young as 7 and 8, who have navigated their way by themselves or with younger siblings into this country, I am inspired every day by the opportunity I have to have encounters, be they brief or lengthy, with young women and women like that who are doing all that they can to create a better life for themselves. And it reminds me that it's my job to do all that I can to create opportunities in LA County to improve the lives of women and girls. I'm inspired by Abby Land, who's the executive director of LA County's initiative on women and girls, and the reports and the data that she's collecting to make sure that as an employer, LA County, and as a service provider, that we are doing that work with a gender-specific lens, particularly now recognizing that women have been disproportionately impacted by the economic side of this pandemic. More women have lost their jobs given the nature of the sectors that were deeply impacted by this public health pandemic. And so it's those women and their wishes and dreams for themselves and the work they do and the leadership and courage that they bring forward that inspire me every day. Students in particular often ask me, because like them, I was a bit of a linear thinker, and you want to know, okay, connect the dots for me. How did you make your decision and become an elected official? And young people in particular, students, assume the journey is linear and a straight ascension. And those of us with a little more gray in our hair understand that that's really not how life is. I had the pleasure of working for yet another mentor, then State Senator Diane Watson, at a formative time in my life, right out of my Choral Foundation Fellowship, which would have made me about 22 years old. And it was an amazing opportunity for me. That's where I met people like Kathy Spiller. It was an amazing opportunity for me to see an example of a strong woman leader and kind of figure out what my own leadership was ultimately going to look like. It was working for her that I was able to connect with women leaders all over the country. It was working for her that I ultimately decided that I didn't want to run for public office, but I thought I was a great number 2 that could prepare her. I loved being the conduit between the constituents. I loved doing the deep policy dive on women's health and adoption and foster care and child welfare services. And from there, I went on to Crystal Stairs, where I had the pleasure of leading this women established, the 2 co-founders were women, organization supporting working families. But it was in that position as CEO of Crystal Stairs that I was sitting in a budget hearing, maybe 2008, and saw the process by which a decision was being made to cut $1 billion out of subsidized childcare. And I knew the potentially irreparable harm that could cause on a generation or two of kids who wouldn't have access to high quality, affordable, accessible early care and education experiences, and how difficult it was for those of us like me, a working mom, to be able to go to work and even think about excelling in the workplace if we didn't have reliable childcare. And it was in that space that I got mad enough to run for office. It was in that space that I realized and acknowledged that my own ordinary life experience as a mother, as a Black woman, as a Native Angelino, as a policy wonk, as a leader of a major family development organization, it was in that space that I found the courage and confidence to make my own declarative statement that I was going to run for office. Because while the state was experiencing historic budget deficit, I also knew that we needed to elect people and have people in the room at the decision-making table that had this lens that really reflects what Sister Crenshaw envisioned 30 years ago in a term paper nonetheless, where she identified and defined for all of us this concept of intersectional feminism. Intersectionality accounts for the connection between race, class, gender, and other individual and societal factors that oppressive systems and policies are built upon. And it was sitting in that budget hearing that I realized that I needed to and wanted to step directly back into the policymaking arena to do what I could to elevate these issues and find solutions. In every seat I've had the privilege of serving in, I've attempted to do just that, to represent that perspective in the policymaking arena. This is how we create intersectional public policy that cuts to the core of the inequities people are facing. Intersectional feminism, I believe, also illuminates the blind spots caused by the varying levels of privilege that we all have. It accounts for everyone and forces us to question where we can be more inclusive and accepting in our pursuit of true justice and liberty for everybody. For me, again, this has meant showing up as my full self and removing barriers through public policy that prohibit others from doing the same and living full lives. The Crown Act, you heard Jessica reference, is one small example. You know, it's hard to believe that in 2020 at that time, that Black women and men, but largely Black women and girls, were the only group of people who could be not hired, not promoted, terminated, or suspended from school because of a hairstyle choice. Not only a hairstyle choice, but a hairstyle choice grounded in the way in which our hair naturally grows. The conversations that I've had the privilege of being engaged in across this country, internationally now thanks to Zoom, have been profound. Some people have suggested, well, it's only hair, while others understand that it truly has been used as a direct form of discrimination. And I think that my mere example as a Black woman leader serving as chair of the budget committee of the 5th largest economy in the world, where not one of my sitting colleagues would ever say, you know, I'm not going to vote on that state budget this year because Holly wears her hair locked. I think that through my example, people could see that the way I choose to wear my hair in its natural state has no bearing on my capacity to do my job and do it well. And I think the Crown Act, the fact that it's now been introduced and passed, and I think we're up to 12 other states, that there's a bill that passed out of our House of Representatives that is on its, or should be on the US Senate floor, is a testament to a collective movement challenging intersectionality and feminism, promoting feminism, and really calling into question a antiquated Euro standard of beauty and that if you don't have straight hair and look a certain way, that you could be perceived as unprofessional or a distraction to others, which is the term that had been used in many school-based dress code policies that allowed those schools and those school districts to suspend girls and young men from showing up to school with their hair locked, twisted, or braids. So this is an example for me about why intersectionality in public policy matters. You know, I'm clear that this law helped widen the lens on what discrimination looks like and the real life implications of hair discrimination, which disproportionately impacts a community already underrepresented in far too many professional sectors, higher education, and so many other indicators of health and well-being. So currently, you know, I have the honor of serving on the LA County Board of Supervisors for the largest county in the nation. For the first time in over 170-year history, the county has an all-female board. For far too many of that 170-year history, it was all male until Yvonne Burke was appointed for a brief time, but Gloria Molina, excuse me, was then elected. And despite us having our gender in common, we're very different leaders. Each of us has a distinct lived experience that makes us uniquely qualified for the seats we hold. The challenges we are focused on addressing for the over 10 million residents we collectively represent are inherently intersectional, impacting multiple populations in different ways. One key issue I've dedicated my life's work to is helping to end deep poverty. I'm proud to share that this week the county passed my motion to establish a countywide poverty alleviation agenda and guaranteed basic income pilot program. The concept of guaranteed basic income has been around for decades, goes back to Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign of the 60s. And as we work to recover from COVID-19 pandemic, poverty alleviation, in my opinion, is an intersectional issue that must be a countywide priority to ensure a truly equitable recovery. We've got a lot of work to do, and it can't be done without considering the experiences of those who don't look like us or live like us. So we have to factor in race, gender, sexuality, economic status, and the multitude of realities experienced by communities most impacted by the social issues we're seeking to solve. And it's clear to me you wouldn't be here if you didn't value the importance of intersectionality and feminism. So continue to boldly stand in the gray to help us develop a clear path to liberation, healing, and justice. To the students who've joined us, I'm excited about what you're achieving and how you move our city, state, and world forward, not back. And to the UCLA Center for the Study of Women, thank you again for the honor of being your 2021 Distinguished Leader in Feminism honoree. I'm proud and humbled and honored to work alongside you in creating a more just and equitable LA County, and look forward to all that we can achieve together. Grace, Jessica, thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that powerful, inspiring address, Supervisor Mitchell, Holly. So we will now move into a conversation about some of the topics you've raised, followed by a Q&A with questions from the audience. So please, as Jessica and I are, speaking to Holly, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, thank you so much. So Jessica, did you want to start?
Well, thank you so much for those wonderful words. And I appreciated your talking about the different leadership styles on the Board of Supervisors right now. Mm-hmm. And one thing I really appreciate about all the elected officials that I am sort of under is that there's this strong intergenerational women of color leadership in these districts. And so I'd love to hear more about mentoring and sponsoring, both how you have been mentored and sponsored, but also how you have mentored and sponsored others, and how to do that in pursuit of intersectional justice and feminism.
And let me start by saying it's not hard. And so it's a shame more people don't do it. I was the absolute true beneficiary of Diane Watson and so many pouring into me. Gwen Moore, who we lost this past year, who I was assigned to for I think it was my government assignment in my choral fellowship is when I met Assemblymember Moore. Went to work for Diane right out of my choral fellowship, first in her district office, providing constituent services, which is the best training ground possible about if you want to run for public office. And then she gave me the opportunity to go to Sacramento. And it was proximity and generosity. It was Diane allowing me to be proximate to her and watching leadership and being literally in the physical space when decisions were made. It was Diane encouraging me when I didn't have the confidence myself to step up and ask questions and truly represent her in a meaningful way. I could hear her in myself telling staff in the last couple of years, if you're in the room at a town hall and you don't acknowledge yourself and who you're representing, it's like we're not represented. And so, she helped me understand that I had to stand up in the gap when she wasn't there to make sure that her constituents knew that I was there, as her eyes and ears, and that I was there for them. And so that's the tutelage and the mentorship I got and was exposed to. And Diane is famous for saying, we reach back as we climb. And so when you think about when she made the decision to retire from Congress, which would allow Karen Bass to run for her seat, which allowed me to run for Karen Bass's seat, all supporting each other, all endorsed by each other. My opportunity to have now Senator Sidney Kamlager-Dove, who was my colleague at Crystal Stairs, who left the agency to come be my district director when I won for the assembly. When I then made my move, she made her move. So I'm really proud to be a sitting elected official, having created an opportunity for two women who worked for me while they worked for me to run for office. While Sydney was my district director, she held her first elected position on the LA Community College Board of Trustees, becoming chairwoman. A young woman who currently works for me, Sonia Lopez, while working for me, ran for Compton College Board of Trustees, becoming its chairwoman, becoming the youngest ever and the first Latina to chair the Compton College Board of Trustees. And so, that lets me know that they got it, that they understood the value of proximity and selflessness, that I shared resources, I supported, gave advice when asked, and gave advice when not solicited, because that's what I think how leadership should be nurtured, how it grows, and how it's freed to take whatever direction that it should choose to take. What I hope both Sydney and Sonia got from that experience is understanding their responsibility to always make sure that they're nurturing leadership as well, to move into either their seats or other seats. That's how we're going to really begin to affect institutional racism and sexism and classism and xenophobia and all of the isms that we're continuing to have to live with and work through now in 2021.
Great, thank you so much. Mentorship is just incredibly important, and it was so amazing to hear you sort of describe that whole chain, which I don't think I quite put all those pieces together. So that's kind of amazing. So switching topics a little bit. So you have a long record of working on criminal justice issues, which is a topic that is close to my heart. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the most pressing ones facing LA County right now, and maybe some of the differences between working on these issues sort of in a state senator capacity as opposed to working on it in terms of LA. We've been hearing a lot about, the sheriff's department and, other sorts of issues. So anything else, anything you'd like to highlight, I'd just love to hear, your thoughts about this.
Well, it's interesting you should raise that. I turned on my Spectrum cable and it goes to Channel 1 Spectrum News, and I heard him talk about county actions yesterday, and I was like, gee, well, 2 of those 3 were my motions. Wow, look at there. Well, one of which was really interesting, as a state policymaker, we're setting policy at the 10,000 foot level, much of which we then count on local government to implement. And so to recognize that my home county had not implemented Senator Skinner's SB 1421, a bill that I voted on and supported, that really talks about transparency in law enforcement, requiring that local law enforcement, reveal records and be transparent in terms of members of law enforcement who've been involved in excessive use of force cases or whatever the case may be that is either led to a lawsuit or led to the death of someone, right? And so to think, gee, as a policymaker representing much of the community I represent today, to vote on that bill, because it really was the will of my constituents. And at the state level, you kind of think, okay, my job here is done. And then to get back to my home county and recognize that our own sheriff was a bit of an outlier and hadn't implemented core aspects of the law. 1421 passed, was signed by the governor, and therefore it is state law, was troubling. And so I now have the opportunity at a local level to look at those kinds of policies to make sure that they're being implemented at the local level. So we introduced a motion. We introduced a motion that said that within 48 hours, the sheriff needs to release the names of the officers who've been involved in officer-involved shootings that led to death. I was interested in hearing that he issued a statement late last night that he now has a policy, whereas he didn't have one, saying that he'll release those names in 30 days. So, that's an example of being vigilant, paying attention, making sure that state laws are being implemented at the local level, and when they aren't, pushing that envelope and seeing systemic change here at the local level.
Thank you. That's such a good example. All right.
Back with piano with Hava Nagila, I think, playing in the background here. But Supervisor Mitchell, you mentioned that the pandemic has disproportionately harmed women, and more women have left the workplace and whatnot. And wow, for your first year in this position to be during the pandemic, that I'd love to hear anything you want to say about that. But then one thing in particular would be, what are the parts of the way that the pandemic has affected women, and especially women of color, that you wish more people understood based on what you see?
I appreciate that. People who have been fighting for and working on behalf of underrepresented groups weren't the least bit surprised to know which communities were hardest hit by this pandemic. Again, dual pandemic, public health and economic. But I think it really has opened the eyes of the entire world, because there's not a single person, wherever you fall on the socioeconomic spectrum, that haven't been impacted in some way. Even those, the folks that I still find it curious, who are doing better economically as a result of the pandemic, right? So even though they've been impacted differently than some of the people we're talking about, everybody's been impacted. And I can't think of another example. The housing crisis didn't impact everybody. When I think about these other crises we faced in recent history, nothing like this. Nothing like this. For folks who went through life thinking, government, whatever, those decisions don't impact my life. Actually, they do, because everyone who woke up one day mid-March last year, 2020, and understood that your schools were closed, and none of us had any idea that it would be a full year of closure. Government impacts everybody's life. And so women were disproportionately impacted, low-income women. The digital divide impacted their children's ability to even log in to the classroom Zoom. The digital divide, as LAEDC recently released a study that I think naively, myself included, really felt the digital divide was about access to the internet. No, it's really about access to affordable internet service. And so far too many of my constituents, I think the number was 2 million countywide, simply can't afford it. It's not that they don't have fiber optics or wiring in their community. They just can't afford the products that are available. When you consider the number of women who didn't have the luxury of staying safe at home. I'm on the Metro Board of Directors. And so every month we talk about the exposure for those who have to take public transit, and think about who they are. The average salary of a bus rider in LA County is $18,000 a year. So they are our lowest income residents who are probably our essential workers. So they had to go to work every day and they had to take public transportation to get there. Mostly women. So those are the issues that I hope that this pandemic has unpacked, and will create a space and an opportunity for me to come in and say, people in communities who were disproportionately impacted by this pandemic deserve a disproportionate investment in all of our recovery efforts and dollars. And that's going to be my mission for the foreseeable future.
Okay, well, so, one last question from us before we move to the audience Q&A. As we mentioned, as Jessica mentioned, you recently worked with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, and actually also in the same project with A New Wave Life. I think a lot of folks might not see how, elected officials, legislators, folks like that, sometimes do work with community organizations. And I think you're such a primary example of someone who does that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between people who have more official elected roles and community organizations who don't have that kind of connection to official state processes.
I am so glad you asked that question, because a couple of answers have popped in my head, and I'm going to try to keep them all coherent and hope that they make sense to you all as they do in my head. Couple things. First of all, my parents met as eligibility workers working for LA County DPSS in the late 50s.
Wow.
And during a time like this, when President Lyndon Johnson had declared a war on poverty and federal dollars were flooding into LA County, particularly after the Watts Rebellion. And so, now looking back, I realized my mother was writing grants and getting creative funding. But what I saw was she was running this pilot program where she was employing the women on her caseload.
Wow.
And so all of the grownups in my life at that very young age, they either worked for the county or they were on the county. And there was no distinction made between these two groups of people, right? Beneficiaries and people who had the power to make those resources available. There was no distinction. All I knew was that people who worked for government, their job was to help people who needed it. And the role of government was to help people. To run a mission-driven organization like I had the privilege of doing for Crystal Stairs, it's the same mission, to provide help to people who need it. And so the unique space I have carved out for myself, having worked in both sectors, government and nonprofit, is to be a translator, is to help government understand the value and the role nonprofits can contribute. And for me to literally be a literal translator to nonprofit organizations about demystifying the budget process and making sure they're at the table when public policies are being debated that will impact the clients they serve. And who better but to be engaged and help frame that policy, but people who run these various programs. And so there should be no distinct line. Each community depends on the other. From a very basic level, here in LA County, we have tens of thousands of nonprofits. They are what I consider small employers. So every effort we put forward through the pandemic and the recovery efforts, when we talk about small business, I've included the nonprofit sector. I think when people say small business, they don't think of nonprofits. So I've attempted to use the term small employer because they do. When I was at Crystal Stairs, I made payroll. I had almost 500 people working for me at one point in time. And so they play a critical role in the recovery of this sector in terms of jobs. They play a critical role in the services they provide in terms of helping support people, connecting them to jobs, job training, childcare, all of the work the nonprofit sector does. Domestic violence, prevention programs, shelters, a new way of life. They are a main artery that helps our county function. And so government, philanthropy, private sector, nonprofits, in a time such as this, we all have work to do to help guide the residents of our county through these times.
Wow, that was so great. That was so interesting about your parents. You know what they say, DPSS is for romance.
Apparently.
Yeah, apparently so. But but I really love that story that you told about your mom employing the people who were, in her case, because, and connected to what you were saying about making, sort of legislation at the sort of 10,000 feet level, right? It's really important, to have the people who are experiencing the things the most, right? Like incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, people who are on, various kinds of social service programs, people who are unhoused or people who are in, or were in the foster care. Like, it's important for those people to have a voice in the process, because otherwise, the legislation comes out weird.
Without question. And right. And not only have a voice in the policymaking process, but have a voice in running the programs too.
Absolutely.
Just to create space, to value their perspective and input, and be open to bringing them to the fold. The two women I grew up remembering, Miss Lattimore, Lorraine Lattimore, and Miss Geraldine, ultimately retired. They had full careers with LA County. I remember my mom saying, I heard from Lattimore today, she just got her 30-year pin. And so when we really talk about how we break down multi-generational poverty, that's a way in which government can be creative and do it.
Oh, okay. Well, we are actually over our allotted time. We're being a little bit selfish. So maybe we can move to the Q&A, and Jessica's going to moderate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Grace. So we have some questions that have come in the Q&A. I'm sorry, I can't see the names of the people who asked them, so I apologize to you for that. But one of them, you were just mentioning intergenerational poverty. And as you mentioned, the pandemic has had a disproportionate adverse effect on underserved communities. So one of our community here wants to know how you're going to think about the children, including the many children who have essentially missed a whole academic year. How do you think the city should address these children's urgent educational needs so they're not permanently left behind?
I wish I had an easy, succinct answer that I could just give you. I don't know. What I do know is we have to figure it out, and we're going to have to work collaboratively. School districts, educators, school districts, city and county and state, to figure out how we help make up for this challenging year. I don't want to say lost year, but a challenging year. I know one thing, this will be a generation of incredibly resilient children. The fact that they survived this, managed it, the creativity, the out-of-the-box thinking, all of us now understand different ways in which we can work. That model may have worked better for some kids than others. Certainly not my 20-year-old who was like, this online stuff is not for me, and it is not for him. I'm a living witness. But to really figure out hybrid models that really can perhaps meet the needs of every individual child. it is going to be a monumental task, without question. One that resources alone won't solve. It is really going to require resources and creativity, and really meeting the needs of the kids where they are, and recognizing that we can't paint a broad brush in terms of what that looks like. It's going to have to be on a very individual basis. You know, one way in which government's got to intervene is closing this digital divide, to make sure that if tutoring through the summer and those kind of supports are made available online, the kids not only have the tablets, but also have the high-speed internet to be able to access it.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that, both the kind of way that the internet is essentially a public utility, or it should be, it's thought of in some ways that way now.
Without question, without question.
And I appreciate your saying too that yes, children have lost a lot, but they've also gained these other skills.
Yeah, they have.
We'll learn from them.
And we will.
Well, another question that one of our the people in the audience had was about homelessness. One of the most difficult problems in LA is homelessness. This person asks, much has been done, but much more needs to be done. What are your ideas in solving these issues as they affect the poor the most? Another easy one.
Easy peasy, right? And let's not forget that it's going to be further complicated and compromised. All of our solutions that are in progress now will be further complicated and compromised by this pandemic. And when various levels of government lift the eviction ban, what that's going to do. And I think one thing that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, so I'll use my time here, is to talk about how we help support keeping people where they are. You know, I introduced a bill in the legislature that stopped discrimination based on income. The people who had the privilege of getting a housing voucher, be it a veteran's voucher or a Section 8 voucher, and then couldn't find a landlord who was willing to accept it. We stopped that. And so making sure that we attempt to, with equal vigor, the same kind of vigor we address people we see in tents and encampments on the street, to approach with equal vigor the people who are on the precipice of entering, who are, you know, maybe a little help, like 1 month's worth of rent, can stay where they are. So exhausting all of those programs to try to keep people housed while we continue to be vigilant in doing the work of expanding our housing stock. LA County is 500,000 housing units short, and continuing to build and building the kind of affordable housing, permanent supportive housing that truly meet the need of our unhoused men, women, and children today. But keeping people where they are is a critical element.
Huge. Thank you for that. One, and you know, we have to move on in a minute, but one last question from the audience here, which is about healthcare. So you've worked on healthcare a lot in your career, and this person is particularly interested in the critical shortage of physicians in many low-income communities in LA, and the way that contributed to disparities that were revealed during the pandemic. So this person wanted to know what your plans were to address that issue. And also I'd invite any other thoughts you have based on your career of working in healthcare about what this pandemic has shown us and where you want to go with healthcare in LA County.
Well, I'm really proud to represent 3 phenomenal institutions: Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital, Charles Drew University, you know, the only West Coast HBCU medical school in the country, and Harbor UCLA, 3 institutions that are doing an amazing job to train residents. And our job will be to do all that we can to keep those residents here, you know, wanting to work in LA County in various places. And then a little further down the road, you know, I represent an amazing school, Gala, which is the only all-girls STEAM academy. So exposing girls at a very young age and supporting them in their pursuance of math and science, to then get to the amazing bioscience lab at the Lundquist Institute at Harbor UCLA, where we saw presentations from 3 PhD students, all of color, 2 of whom were women, in the science and medical sphere. 1 PhD student who is studying the connection between obese lactating mothers and whether they pass on the obesity gene through lactation. Just fascinating research that has direct real life impact on people living in that very neighborhood and community today. And so I'm thrilled to continue to fund and support those institutions that are going to grow and create opportunities for future doctors to be able to be educated, graduate, and practice right in their own community. I think those kinds of investments are the kinds of investments government has the capacity to make. And I'm going to do all I can to support those institutions and more.